Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is why people die either during or shortly after sex. The unexpected but certainly beneficial benefit of COVID-19 vaccination in reducing the risk of severe inflammatory syndrome in children. Kombucha supposedly has a particular benefit, something similar to fasting, or at least so say some researchers. CBD products aren't useful for reducing pain, although claims to the contrary persist. Researchers after our own heart have decided to put tardigrade proteins into human cells and find out what happens. New Zealand has had a epidemic of sorts, except instead of COVID, it's thousands of eels are just dying, and sadly not for the first time. AI is used in creating better plants through gene editing. A magnetic avalanche triggered using a weird quantum effect called Barkhausen noise. And we have a total eclipse for you this week. The timestamps for these news items and others can be found in the description box below. Let's start with why it is that people die either during or shortly after sex. And yes, it's a surprisingly common phenomena. In terms of sudden unexplained deaths, it accounts for about 0.5%. So we are talking about something surprisingly significant. Although then again, it isn't just the elderly or middle-aged people. For example, those using the little blue pill. Instead of horny old people, we have actually young individuals, for example 33-year-olds, dying suddenly. In fact, speaking of 33-year-olds, one of the biggest studies looked at postmortem studies, or effectively forensic analyses, of 32,000 individuals who died over a 33-year-old period, and they found that of these unexpected deaths, 0.2 occurred during sexual activity, which is still a significant number. While we may glibly say that it's horny middle-aged men, it's not necessarily just men. About 35% of all these cases are actually women who die, so we are talking about a roughly 2-to-1 ratio. This does mean that if a woman is involved, she has about half as likely a chance of dying as her partner is if they're a male. The reason behind all of this is surprisingly straightforward in some ways, although perhaps not what you'd expect. Typically, most people would think it would be something like a heart attack, but no, strangely enough, it's actually a sudden arrhythmic syndrome, or as it's called, SADS. This is basically a change in the way the heart beats, causing it to beat incorrectly. That accounts for about half of all the deaths. The next leading cause is aortic dissection. That is when there's either congenital defect in the aorta, or in most cases it's a defect that's developed over time, which, due to the increase of blood pressure during strenuous activity, suddenly finds that that floor is simply too weak and it breaks, leading to, well, a final outcome. Or is it a final coming? In news that's not going to come anywhere, we have type 3 diabetes, or effectively type 3 insulin resistance, and claims that this is a thing. No, this is not going to be a thing. Stop trying to make it a thing. The whole premise is that during Alzheimer's disease, the neurons in the brain become somewhat resistant to insulin. Now, this is preliminarily true. That is to say, preliminary studies have found that there is insulin resistance in neurons of the brain during Alzheimer's disease, and particularly related to both the degenerative process and the dysfunction. But importantly, it is one element of a very complex disorder, and frankly, the blog Science-Based Medicine goes through in great detail why it is that this is not true, but it is adequate to say for now that although, yes, insulin resistance has been found, there's also been a dozen other different mechanisms that have also found similar kinds of situations where they've been touted as the be-all and end-all of explanations for Alzheimer's disease, something that is just blatantly untrue. Alzheimer's disease has been associated with genetics to some extent, with hypertension, with exposure to certain environmental factors and more. All of these have been contributing factors, but no one particular explanation has been able to find the answer. That's because Alzheimer's seems to be a series of downstream effects that are all causing one particular outcome. It's effectively something at the very start is triggering multiple different possible mechanisms that all converge on the same end result. This is a rather long-winded way of saying, no, it isn't real. Type 2 diabetes is a made-up piece of bullshit. Compared considerably to things like, say, COVID-19, where we have definitive evidence. But we also have increasing amounts of data about its benefits, and particularly some of the more, let's say, important benefits when it comes to children. And yes, won't somebody think of this children is an obvious outcome? You can not put that in the comments. Let's start with what it does do that's helpful, and that is, there was, at the very start of COVID and going into it, evidence that it was causing multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children, that is COVID-19 itself. This was a concern because that could lead on to all kinds of other issues. Basically, it was a initial trigger for a whole bunch of other complications, some of which could be very long-term if not permanent for the children involved. Well, fortunately, the vaccine dealt with that to some extent. But also, it provided a second benefit. See, you're getting bang for your buck with multiple vaccines. You don't need all these other different vaccines not to have your kids dying, which is great if you like children. Probably not if you don't like children, in which case you may want to keep that to yourself. But the inflammatory syndrome in children was leading to another issue, and that is simply that, well, it led to a severe inflammatory syndrome. This is particularly nasty in that, well, kids don't take well to inflammatory conditions. Being vaccinated dropped this drastically, and we mean really drastically. The effect of vaccination for COVID-19 has lowered the incidence rate to 0.11 cases per million person months. Understand, that's about 1/10 of a case a month, compared to nearly 6.8 cases per million person months. Yeah, that's a huge drop, and you can't deny the benefits. It's roughly 1/68. The other benefit is that it's lowered the age, at least the average age, from 9 years to 7 years. Now, it's important to note that this is still somewhat older than other inflammatory diseases, but the fact that there are younger children is more in line with what you'd expect to see in terms of the kinds of disease we're talking about. Having older children experience this is unusual. The other important element to this is that in terms of those children most likely to develop sudden inflammatory conditions like this, is that it's those who are not vaccinated. That is, either being not vaccinated at all, only having had a single dose of the vaccine, or being well and truly more than a year out from their last vaccination. Therefore, vaccinate your kids. Compare this with the next news item we have for you, and that is, people are being not just dumb, but dangerous. They're drinking methylene blue in an effort to detox themselves. Methylene blue will not detoxify you. In fact, it's a particularly nasty toxin in and of itself, simply because it can cause methemoglobinemia. Effectively, it blocks the hemoglobin within your red blood cells from carrying oxygen, and oxygen is rather important if you aren't aware. And as such, well, you can imagine what happens when you start drinking it to detoxify yourself. You're going to feel worse, therefore assume you're going to have more toxins in your body, drink more of it, feel even worse, and the issues are just keep rolling from there as you get progressively more sick, as you slowly asphyxiate yourself. Of course, methylene blue is not the only fad out there. You have things like kombucha, and claims that kombucha is good for you in all kinds of ways. And at least one study has given some credence to this claim. The idea is that if you drink kombucha, it could have a similar effect to fasting, although that seems a little bit far-fetched given that, kombucha is basically a tea with a small amount of yeast and other bacteria and some sugar added to it. Part of the argument is that it's effectively a way of colonizing your GI tract with good bacteria. Well, good is somewhat questionable, but let's assume that's correct for now. Where this study gets, let's say they are overselling their results, is they ran the entire study using roundworms, or more specifically C. elegans, which is a fairly common research organism, and they've tried to claim that the findings they found in the roundworm translate to the human GI tract. Something that isn't necessarily true, mostly because, the roundworm has a relatively short GI tract compared to the humans, and, humans are complex. We have a big digestive system compared to the roundworm. Apart from the fact that the stomach is full of acid and digestive enzymes, we have a whole bunch of other things added in the duodenum, and then a whole bunch of problems later on, or at least problems for this study. Kombucha is not the only alternative or fad therapy that's under fire this week. Cannabis is taking a lot of flack as well, and again, not necessarily for the bad reasons. In this case, it's THC, the psychoactive compound in cannabis, is supposed to be useful, but, depending on what you're using it for, this may not be true. The concern is that, to be nice about this, the study has found that cannabis, as it's at least sold in Colorado, may contain much more than just the THC that you want to get a high from, and this is a concern, mostly because, if you're smoking it, you're intending to get high, but if you're causing other issues, you could find yourself in a situation, ironically, very much reminiscent of claims about Big Pharma. The general idea of this study was that consumers will consume cannabis for the THC, generally speaking, to help them with pain and discomfort, but also if they're allowed to buy it recreationally. This brings us to the, findings of the study, and that is, people aren't necessarily getting what they're buying, or at least not what they're told they're buying. In this case, the issue is you either get considerably more than what you're expecting to get, or considerably less than what you're expecting to get. And that's a problem. And we mean considerably more or less. While getting a little bit more or less than what you're expecting may not seem like a problem, 15% more or less, and in some cases as much as 30% less, is a problem. The concern with this is that these results were found by sending samples out to an independent laboratory, and they compared those independent results to what was claimed by the retailers, and so getting, as mentioned, significantly more or less, and in some case a lot less than what you're expecting, is not just a problem in terms of the actual product quality, but also in terms of the actual consistency and compliance with the law around advertising standards. This brings us to other news about the benefits of cannabis-type products, and an interesting example. Something that happens with cannabis, particularly the THC within it, is that if it's stored for long enough, the THC will effectively break down and turn into cannabinol, otherwise known as CBD. And CBD is sold as a panacea for all your ailments, whether it's pain, anxiety, wanting your pet to stop barking, and so on. In this case, at least one meta-analysis has found that no, CBD doesn't at least help with pain. In this case, we are specifically talking about its role and benefit in terms of chronic pain, so there may be a role to play in other conditions, as trying to extrapolate out the results of this meta-analysis elsewhere may not be the best decision. So specifically, CBD does not help with chronic pain. The important thing with this is that it's not just that CBD has a lack of evidence to support its use, but what you're actually buying may not be what you think you're buying, and this is a problem. A lot of the products either contained significantly less than what they were claiming to have, only slightly more, or had, to be blunt about it, contaminants in the form of THC. That is, the psychoactive component of cannabis. This would indicate that there is at best a lack of quality control, and at worst a lack of care when it comes to selling CBD products. Shifting to something far more common, at least in recent years, and some concerns, and that's claims that hand sanitizers could be contributing to damaging brain cells, although this is a particularly controversial claim, let's say. The argument is that there is a relationship between the hand sanitizer and oligodendrocytes, although notably only under laboratory conditions. The idea with the oligodendrocytes is that they're meant to wrap around neurons and help with the neuronal signal going along much quicker. This is all well and good in parts of the brain where you need to have messages sent very quickly. For example, if you're trying to be able to see something, you want that in real time, or at least as close as possible. This brings us to what they found, and they found two particular classifications of compounds. One of these were quaternary compounds, the other one is organophosphates. Both of which they have their particular roles. One of which is simply to serve as a flame retardant. After all, you don't particularly want your hand sanitizer catching flame too easily. In order to demonstrate their findings of these particular chemicals in the brains of the rodents they were experimenting on, they gave them the hand sanitizer orally. And now, feel free to correct us, but as far as we're aware, a rodent's hands aren't in their mouth, so giving them the hand sanitizer orally seems like an odd decision. Now, we're not in the least surprised that if you're going to give the rodents this particular set of chemicals, the quaternary compounds or the organophosphates, you're going to find them in the brain of an animal when you administer it orally. That's kind of obvious. And not just that though, the quantity that they exposed the rodents to, and later on the organoids, was way beyond any kind of exposure you would see in real life. Therefore, seeing any kind of consequences isn't that surprising. It's the whole argument of a dose makes poison, and in this case, nobody is exposed to these kinds of levels of hand sanitizer in real life. Therefore, seeing these kinds of results is, well, to be blunt about it, kinda bullshit if you want to relate them to real human results. Turning to slightly more relevant, but still kind of crazy, but crazy in a wonderful way piece of news, we have inserting tardigrade proteins into human cells. Now, the tardigrade, or water bear, tends to get a unfortunate amount of crap thrown at it, and in some cases we throw the tardigrade at the crap, quite literally at one point throwing them as fast as possible at various solid structures to see if they survived. In this case, thankfully, tardigrades weren't necessarily harmed, or at least very harmed by this experiment. One of the parts that they were looking at was the ability that they have to basically survive in incredibly cold conditions. Generally speaking, basically freezing conditions. What they do is they start making a protein that has the benefit of preventing their blood, and therefore the cells within the blood, from being damaged by crystallization of the water content. Basically, if you were to freeze a regular cell, that cell would not just break in part because the ice is somewhat larger in volume than the cell normally would deal with, but also that frozen ice is, well, spiky, causing it to punch holes in the cell membrane. This prevents that to some extent. It's similar in a way to adding antifreeze to your engine. It prevents the coolant from getting frozen solid. The reason this is important is that if you have cells in particular, but presumably whole organisms if this becomes relevant to further research, the frozen water would prevent the parts of the cell that need water from having access to it, therefore dehydrating them and, well, destroying them. This approach that the tardigrade has prevents that from happening because the water remains at least in a somewhat liquid state, thereby preventing the inevitable and certainly unwanted effect of the osmosis effect basically coming into play, drawing water out of those rather important and essential cell-like functions. Shifting to epidemiological news, and what is more a interesting development, or at least understanding of where diseases come from. It's that in terms of things like viruses, humans are more of a threat to other species than other species are to us. And that's down to the fact that we carry quite a number of particular viruses that, if shared, could be dangerous. It really does undermine that claim that sharing is caring. Well, unless you care to cause disease, in which case, yes, sharing is caring. The study basically presents it this way. Humans live just about everywhere, and we have a very large population. We also carry a surprising number of viruses quite regularly. Of course, the most apparent at the moment would be COVID-19, but even the annual influenza strain simply comes and goes from each hemisphere because we travel all around. This means we are an excellent vector for spreading disease. And mind you, so are children. Children are basically plague carriers, but humans as a whole are still pretty good. This also brings us to the second problem. That is, we tend to cause a great deal of stress and problems for species around us. This makes them vulnerable to infection. And so we have let's say a bad habit of sharing our diseases with wild animals who are stressed by our activities. This does mean that even if, for instance, we were to eradicate a disease from the human population, it would remain in the wild animal population. We see this exact phenomena with tuberculosis and, say, badgers in the UK, cows and others for that matter as well. While humans are a danger to animals, animals themselves may just be shit out of luck, and that's demonstrated none better than by New Zealand at the moment, where for the second time this year, eels have just been found dead en masse in parts of the country. In this case, it's the second time, but rather than in the far south, it's the far north, which means New Zealand from top to bottom have basically been seeing eels dropping dead like crazy. 3,500 eels this time. Unfortunately, there's no exact explanation yet. There are several theories, ranging from a lack of oxygen dissolved in the water to things like algae causing issues to do with the water quality, and even just toxins being in the water full stop. Next we have a similar sort of news item, but it's the juncture between environment and, to some extent, well, consumerism. It's a self-pigmenting textile that is basically a fabric or similar that would color itself, but it's grown from cellulose-producing bacteria. Yeah, this is a really bizarre way to make fabric or other materials, but it makes a lot of sense. It would be, in an arguable case, superior to things like cotton that only need to be grown with massive fields, then harvested, processed, spun, and then turned into material which can then be dyed and used as a material for making clothing. Instead, this has more or less skipped the majority of those first few steps and jumped straight to being a readily usable fabric. The major caveat to this whole situation is what they're making, and that's cellulose, which arguably is a perfectly usable material if handled correctly. For example, if you've ever bought anything like, say, socks or underwear made with bamboo, you'll note that it's a perfectly usable material if combined with others. In this case, though, it's just the cellulose made from the bacteria that were genetically modified to produce it. And not only, though, did they produce the material, but by having a particular gene added alongside the ability to make it, they were able to color it, in this case a dark black color. While the development itself isn't quite on par with, say, 3D printing, the premise does allow for what could basically be described as a rapid prototyping of a kind. That is, you can produce the necessary cellulose and various colors fairly quickly, allowing for a fairly quick fabrication method and therefore a new group of textiles that are quick, cheap, and reasonably environmentally friendly. After all, the cellulose can break down and is very readily biodegradable. In similar news around things like cellulose, we have almost the opposite approach. We want to keep the cellulose, but we want to remove the lignin, and this is done by genetically modifying the trees so that they produce the cellulose without lignin. Now, this is kind of quirky in what it's doing. It's quirky in that, on one hand, lignin's important because it helps to grow trees big and tall, but it's not really helpful for paper and fiber industries because it lowers the quality of products made. Therefore, removing lignin will keep trees shorter and squatter. On the other hand, it will mean that the paper made from them is, superior. The initial work was rather broad. That's because they developed 174 different tree lines through genetic modification to try and find the best ratio of cellulose to lignin and the best decrease in lignin content. The most extreme examples found a 29% decrease in lignin content and a nearly 230% increase in cellulose to lignin ratio. Staying on the concept of food, but instead of going forwards to what we'll see in the future, instead it's a look at the origins of popcorn, or at least a modern popcorn. There is ancient evidence of popcorn showing up thousands of years ago, just not what we'd be familiar with today. First popcorn that we'd effectively be familiar with today is one of the benefits of World War II. It was a byproduct of research involving radar systems. The researcher, Percy Spencer, unfortunately lost his chocolate bar as it melted in his pocket. Assuming the magnetron and melted chocolate bar were related, he took popcorn kernels into the laboratory the next day, which is something you should never do. Food does not go in the laboratory. And, surprisingly, the popcorn popped, which is good and all, but not much use, as this doesn't help us, but it does lead to the first microwave popcorn. Going to what is more accurately technology news now, we have a magnetic avalanche. Although magnetic avalanche is a weird way of describing it, given that it's caused by quantum effects and the Barkhausen noise. Where this is important is that it's a first-of-kind discovery, in a manner of speaking anyway. Why this is not only a discovery of a kind, but described as a Barkhausen-type noise effect, is down to what's happening. When you have a magnet, the magnetic field doesn't exactly all show up in the same way. Rather, it tends to clump together in particular ways, and by clumping together in particular ways and then slowly aggregating more and more, it works out eventually. Importantly though, each different cluster of similar but distinct and different magnetic fields within the larger field tend to interfere with and influence each other. thereby causing a particular change in the way it works. As a normal rule, you'd expect to see this kind of phenomena in terms of magnetic fields occur through thermal conductivity, that is, by adding heat into the thing you're trying to work with, typically a magnet. But in this case, they're able to achieve it mechanically, but more accurately, quantum mechanically. In fact, what the researchers were doing was, in some ways, almost exactly the opposite of what you would typically expect to see. Instead of heating up the magnet, they cooled it down, and by cooling it down, you're having the exact opposite of the normal approach. They then ran a current through this, and through something called quantum co-tunneling, they're able to basically work their way through the field without having to actually interfere with the field, in so many words anyway. Going to more tangible news, and in this case quite literally, we have what may well be a part of one of NASA's cargo pallets falling into Florida and nearly taking out a man and his child by busting through not only the roof, but then the next floor to hit the bottom story of his house. Either that, or this is Florida's man's origin story and he's about to get superpowers, which is somewhat less likely now that NASA has taken away the mass in question. The issue is that the mass was meant to burn up in the atmosphere when it was released in 2021. The issue is that, well, it clearly hasn't burnt up if it is that, but also, importantly, it didn't land where they were expecting it to land, to some extent anyway. It was meant to land in the Gulf of Mexico, and, well, if this is true, it's not the Gulf of Mexico. On the other hand, at least somewhat fortunately, it didn't land slightly further along its trajectory, which would have been in the middle of Fort Myers. The Florida man in this case can at least be happy that it wasn't one of the larger things that have fallen from space in recent history. For example, China's Long March rockets. The final news we have for you this week is the solar eclipse, which should be visible in parts of America. Unfortunately, not very much in terms of parts of America. More or less, if you were to draw a line between Texas and Maine, you would more or less be able to figure out where it is that you can see the best part of the solar eclipse. Assuming that this is not some sort of cult summoning effort for an eldritch god, in which case you may not see it, but you'll know about it very soon. Other than the fact that it's an awesome thing to see, the solar eclipse is also useful for astronomers who want to get a look at certain parts of the sun that just aren't practical without this. If you want to be able to see things like the corona of the sun, you need to use incredibly difficult and expensive equipment, or have access to things in space. Something, unfortunately, most astronomers don't. With the solar eclipse the way it is, instead, they can do this with relatively cheap equipment, and therefore get a lot of useful data that they can analyze, which is all the more useful, mostly because, well, as mentioned, it allows them to do work that they otherwise can't. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.